hello student, and welcome to the CEC live session. In this session we are going to introduce the key text on introduce some of our beginning on key text in sociology. A new series on key text from social sciences, humanities and arts is going to begin, and today is the first lecture in this series. And in order of the series, we thought that we will begin with a formal discussion so that we are clear about the intention, why we do need a series on key text, and how we are going to go about it. So we will be discussing in detail about the key series called key text in sociology, social sciences, arts and humanities. And for this discussion we have with us Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri. Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri teaches at the Center for Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has a vast experience of teaching for several decades and also has been a part of the CEC live session, having delivered lectures, a number of lectures on this series. And for this we will begin by trying to ask Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri, who is actually trying to develop this series on key text. And then welcome ma'am to this series on key text. And let us begin by trying to understand at this time of period, why do we need a series called key text? What is the rationale for developing such a course?
Yeah, I think this is a very relevant question, and it's something that we need to spell out explicitly before we actually start the series on the key text. There are a couple of things, as Aruna has already mentioned. The fact that these key texts will be from various kinds of disciplines or subjects, broadly social sciences and humanities. And you would promptly ask me perhaps that why is this so? Because very often we have courses which are specific to subjects and not cutting across subjects. But as many of you are aware, that in contemporary contexts, the idea of interdisciplinarity is not new, but the idea the currency which it has acquired in the modern educational system in our parts of the country has become more urgent today. Aruna is perhaps more familiar, somebody who's teaching at the undergraduate level and is involved in syllabi constructions in the university, the need for interdisciplinarities and the whole issue of what is that?
CBCS.
CBS, yeah. Can you sort of explain that, and I will then develop this issue of rationale more.
CBCS, which stands for Choice Based Credit System, is a syllabus has been introduced by UGC in the year 2016, and this is basically an open choice based credit system which gives students a flexibility of changing or selecting options other than the one which they have. So there are three kinds of courses which are taught to students at the undergraduate level, that is the main core, and we have elective, and then we have skill enhancement course. The generic elective and the skill enhancement courses are intentionally designed in a manner to give more choice to the student. So for example, if an undergraduate student of sociology honors wants to do a paper on history, on modern history, so you have an optional called generic elective called modern history in India, and this CBCS gives us the flexibility to the sociology students to opt for a paper in the history department. And also there is a scope that if in case one wants to do a course in another university, in other college, there is a chance of flexibility. So it basically keeps into mind two things. One is the idea of interdisciplinary, where the student is not only stuck to the course subject, and second, the whole idea of evaluation, which is now grading system. So there is a system on which the grades are given to students. Earlier they were giving percentage wise, and therefore there is a kind of flexibility in the whole system. So the focus is actually on interdisciplinarity
and questions of
choice.
Now, this may be a particular decision which has been taken at the highest body of the UGC, and therefore would probably be increasingly implemented in universities across the country. So there's a great relevance to understand what is the basic rationale or the justification or the assumption of having interdisciplinarities and choices. This also relates to the point that disciplines or subjects like history, political science, sociology, economics, literature, Hindi literature or English literature, new areas like cultural studies, new areas like media studies, journalism, they are subjects which very often we take as though they are taken for granted, that they are given, they are divinely ordained, they were always there. But if you talk to your parents, and perhaps if you talk to your grandparents, you will realize that even disciplines and subjects have a history behind them. Very often older generations, say my parents' generation, would basically have a division between arts and sciences, and within arts it would be history, economics and literature. But subjects like sociology, in our parts even social anthropology, many of those subjects slowly came into being. So it's very important, this particular series on texts make us engage to the very basis which led to the emergence of social sciences and humanities, that there is in a certain sense a commonality between all the different subjects that we now talk of as specialized subjects. Those of you who are from sociology background would be familiar with the idea of Durkheim, where he argues that in simple societies you have a mechanical solidarity, in complex and contemporary societies you have organic, there's greater division of labor, there's greater specialization which takes place in modernity. And therefore, it is necessary to have specialized courses on economics or specialized courses on gender studies, which I had forgotten to mention, or specialized studies in media studies or sociology. But the fact of the matter is there is a certain commonality which runs through these courses. To give you a certain example, say whichever subject you may take, economists, they also teach, maybe Marx, they teach Adam Smith. Maybe when we teach sociology, we also teach Marx, so do political scientists, they also teach Weber, so do sociologists teach Weber. Weber has written extensively on comparative histories of religion. So there is a lot of commonality which is there. But unfortunately, in an era where you have specialized knowledge and there's great shortage of time, all of you are driven by the whole issue of examinations, it is very difficult to go back to broader questions which engage us, that what is it which prompted these people to write in the fashion they did. This particular series gives us an opportunity to go back to the larger terrain, to go back to what is it which is common, of which we are all inheritors, but which we often forget in the pressure of covering syllabi, in teaching courses. But if a familiarity with these texts will help you, in fact, to address specific questions which emerge and which may be restricted to a particular syllabi. A more practical kind of response would be when you sit for an entrance exam for a university or for a job or for maybe for the UPSC, the syllabi is often cuts across subjects. You would have thinkers which are common in different subjects. So very often you feel that what is the point of having a particular discussion on key original texts of various thinkers? It takes away from the immediate need to address a certain examination to complete a syllabi. This in fact allows you to enter into more fundamental questions, which does not take away, in fact it enhances your ability to address questions which you will have to when you answer a certain kind of exams or a certain kind of protocol. This I am talking with people who are in different subjects or students and people who are preparing for various kinds of examination. But this series would also be relevant to a larger body of people. Larger body of people who may be interested to learn about a particular kind of text that we have. We often mention, but we know very little about, and therefore I would also like to explain that this is important for students in different subjects. This is important for young people who are sitting for various kinds of examinations. This is important for the larger public. The larger public I am deliberately referring to because we live in a world where the media has become extremely important as a source of knowledge. And if you look back in the olden days when we had All India Radio, very often you actually would have very informed kind of discussions. Again, to give an example from sociology, you had very well-known sociologists, who would have informed radio talks. Radio discussions which were taking place. So we take this opportunity that the CEC offers us here today to introduce this series and be in a position to address a wide section of what we call the public sphere.
So as you rightly said, that some of the courses are taught across disciplines. Some of the key texts which are like Karl Marx or Durkheim, Weber are taught in different department. At the same time, you're also saying that the texts would be used for different public, that is for the student as well as the examiners as well as for the larger public. But one problem here or the question that arises is basically the way in which education system has been structured in our institution is that our students, especially at the undergraduate level, tend to look at a text within a certain boundary. For instance, texts are prescribed for certain papers, texts are for certain courses. So if they are reading that text, it is within that boundary that they are going to actually read. So if I am reading a text for sociological thinkers, so I'll read Karl Marx only for conflict theory. And similarly, if I go back to examination and we take UPSC, which is a larger intake of students for the exam, they also have papers. So in paper 1 you have something like thinkers and Karl Marx is mentioned. So you are only going to read that text for Karl Marx in terms of theory. So what is actually the right mode of reading a text so that we get a wider
you're absolutely
idea.
right. I think the whole issue is about education system. And policymakers have obviously been engaged with this issue, and therefore they have suggested choice-based courses. But again, it is done in a mechanical fashion. You don't go back to the question of why choice, and why the whole question of interdisciplinarities. The moment you say interdisciplinarities, you are putting forward a question to the watertight compartments of certain subjects or disciplines. So I think it's important that this gives us an opportunity to engage with interdisciplinarities. Very simply put, all these texts from whichever subject. Now it's very difficult to say which subject will we put Marx in, because it was across all. He himself was a journalist, right? Many of the other thinkers were philosophers. So which subject do you put them in? So this is later on. So even if people start becoming aware of the man-made or women-made nature of subjects, that itself brings in the critical perspective which is so central to social sciences. What is common to all of them was that they were engaging with the social. They were trying to understand the social. I understand that Marx is taught in conflict theory within a particular discipline in a particular university, and it is not wrong.
It's not wrong.
It is not wrong to do so. But there is much more to it, there is much more to the whole issue. Supposing I give you a simple question that was Marx a theoretician of capitalism or was he a theoretician of socialism? What would be the answer? Now, if you look at conflict mechanically from a guidebook perspective, you would think he must be talking about class conflict and socialism. But say most of his central writings are actually writings on capitalism and modernity, not on socialism. He never saw a socialist society. Okay, so that means it also questions of relevance. It opens up. Take Weber, and here Weber again is a thinker whom people usually associate with interpretative method and the meaning attributed. But most of his writings are on comparative historical nature. take his Protestant Ethic and Rise of Capitalism, where he is really doing a causal relationship to understand in which societies does capitalism arise. We very often, in our attempt to be examination driven, we restrict the scope of these thinkers, and we actually do a terrible, we reduce them. So it becomes definitions. And those definitions are not even from the original text. Those definitions may have been taken from a commentary which has become more popular than the original text. And most significantly, one of the tasks that we are going to try and show, that these texts are not only extremely exciting, but relatively simple. And I think that is something which people have an assumption that these texts are very difficult.
Yeah, so like when we have both the kinds of material ready for the student, on one side we have guidebooks and the other is a text, and there's also a mindset which says guides are easier to read and textbooks are a little difficult because the original writings of philosophers. So students generally do this comparison between easy commentary or a guidebook, and we also have Google and Wikipedia and number of sources from which they get an idea about thinker, his writing, his or her writing. So how do we actually differentiate what is easy and what is difficult?
This is a very important question, because there is a great pressure that make it simple or make it easy. And in our country, this issue of simplicity and easy is also compounded by the fact of language. The fact that most social sciences are, being written in languages which are not our own. They are Western kind of writing. So Durkheim wrote in French, that was translated. Marx wrote in German. Weber wrote in German, that was translated in turn in English. Unfortunately, unlike many other countries, for example in Iran, where most of these texts are available in Persian and very high-end Persian, so people are able to do it. And I really hope that many people who would be listening to this text take up this challenge to do the translation. High quality translation. We have our own limitations. So maybe I can give a talk in Bengali, which is my own language, but maybe stumbling in Hindi. Somebody else can give an excellent lecture in Hindi, but maybe finding English more difficult or challenging. We have to recognize this. Recognize that there is an issue, but that does not mean that we simplify everything to a ridiculous extent that it does not have any family resemblance to the original text. The second point that you mentioned about Google, I like that point, because this is a generation who are familiar with the internet, unlike perhaps my generation. The good part of the internet is that many of the original texts are now available on the net. And it is simple to find out what they actually wrote. Earlier it was a mystery, the capital or some other thinker, what did they write about, so it would be difficult. Now they are available. They are available, and you can see for yourself that it is not so difficult. So when you say easy and difficult, very often what we mean by easy is that we can memorize a particular definition, and if we can reproduce the definition, we can get marks. That problem is not with students, the problem is with the system. The students will obviously want more marks. If I was a student, I would want more marks, But the problem as teachers is a challenge that we underestimate our students. I have taught, for now many decades, and I have taught students from very different kind of backgrounds. Most have an ability to address text. It depends on how you're introduced and how slowly and carefully you go. The problem again is time. We have no time. Syllabus has to be finished. This has to be, semester system has to be finished, and we are more interested in finishing. If there are 11 topics, all 11 have to be finished. Fortunately, I taught in a university, supposing we have not finished the 11th, but we make sure that the 10 have done extensively and students can follow up, But that kind of to and fro has not happened. But in world over, in the best universities, that's how it happens, that people don't have a fixed syllabi. You give readings and you proceed in that fashion, So I think the issue of, easy and difficult is a serious issue. It has to be taken. It is a challenge to us as teachers that can we communicate in a simple and exciting fashion what these texts were.
Yeah, talking about teaching and the experience of teaching, another very important issue that we face as undergraduates teaching is in terms of the relevance of these texts. Some of these old classical texts has been written in the 19th century, so and students belong to the 21st century. So the one question that is continuously asked in the classroom is, why do we need to read a text which was written in such a early time, in the early 19th century? How is it relevant of reading a text written in a different century and being interpreted in a different manner in the present?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very relevant question, and again reaffirms the point that students are quick, they are sharp, and they ask questions which need to be addressed. You can't answer that question by saying it is there in the syllabi. That's a bad answer. The answer has to be that, okay, has there been changes which are completely different, which has transformed the societies that we live in today in 2018 from the societies in which these thinkers were writing, And if you look at it, perhaps the person who lived in 15th century or 14th century, their lives were totally different from the person who lived in the 19th century. What is it which marked the 19th century, or in the West, the period after the 17th century from earlier periods? This is a topic which all students who have done social sciences would be familiar. The birth of the Industrial Revolution, the growth of capitalism, ideas of democracy, liberalism, French Revolution, ideas of the Enlightenment, the whole issue of critique, which became a dominant form of knowledge systems, And these thinkers, you must also realize, were human beings like any of us, and they were trying to grapple with the changes that they were encountering. They witnessed before their eyes large-scale migration from the rural to the urban. They saw before their eyes growth of slums in London City, terrible conditions of working class, breakups of family, questioning of religion, killing of many of the aristocrats in the French Revolution, questioning everything. And there was a certain sense that nothing is solid anymore, and that's a very famous quote from Marg, that everything seems to have melted, everything is now in matters of contract, all that is sacred is over. These people were living during those periods and saying, what is it which is changing? Issue of women, issue of class, issue of race, all these issues were raising. Now look at our own country today in the 21st century. We too are living in tumultuous time. Everything is changing. Any middle class family, parents will say that we don't understand what these children are doing. They're only looking at the smartphone. Yes, the smartphone and technology has changed dramatically, but many other issues, capitalism, democracy, market versus the state, state social welfare, gender relations, class relations, peace, public, they remain questions which are central. These are the thinkers which were addressing. Zimmel addressed the issue of the shopper in a marketing situation. These are issues which are completely central.
Central. Also, when we are talking in terms of time, we also think about the space or the context in which, so most of the theorization of these texts, if I take for the discipline of sociology, has been written in the Western context. So we being located in a kind of a third world country, kind of a developing country, many a time nowadays when students start questioning and they start thinking critically, they try to understand that why are all these texts coming in from a different context and being given to us to understand our problem or a situation which is completely different.
Absolutely. I think this also is a very, very valid point. In fact, interestingly, we'll come to it later, we are not only going to do Western texts, we are going to do Indian texts, and but that does not mean that we don't have to engage with the question of West and non-West in a more critical fashion. We were colonized. So you can ask that why should we learn about capitalism in the West? What relevance does it have for us? But because capitalism grew in the West, they needed colonies for their market, for their raw material. All of you are familiar with it. We were dragged into their expansion. We had no choice. Nobody knocked and said, excuse me, do you want to be colonized or do you want capitalism? It is part of our history. It is maybe an unfortunate, maybe some people would say not so unfortunate, tryst with history, which is part of the life that we live in. We cannot one day get up and say that, look, that past does not exist. That past existed. That past existed and remained central to us, and remain when we talk about indigenous people who went from Bihar or Uttar Pradesh to Fiji and Suriname. Now, why did they go there? They went there because they were part of this global capitalism, and we were their colonies. They were taken by the British. Is it relevant for us or is it not? When you read about PIO in newspapers, it is 2018. And you cannot understand PIO in 2018 without going back to where did they come from. That knowledge has to be addressed, to the whole question. Questions about contemporary period, should there be privatization of education or not? Those debates have taken place elsewhere too. The West is not just about Western culture, it's all about also a system. Maybe we can have this, continue in this conversation a little later. Okay. Yeah.
With this, we come to an end of our first session, and in the first session we have had a very healthy discussion on the terms of relevance of reading a text even written in a different time, in a different space, becomes equally important to read it in order to understand the problems of our contemporary society. And it is important to mention to dear students, if you have any queries or questions regarding the session, please feel free to call on our toll-free number, which is 1-800-110-430. But it is a kind request that please put in your questions in the last 10 minutes of the session, so that we are able to complete our discussion with which is Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri. With this, we take a break. Thank you. Welcome back to the second half of this lecture, and today we are doing an introductory lecture on introducing the series on key text. And in continuation with the lecture discussion that we are having with us with our dear Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri, and she has taken time out to explain to us the relevance of reading text and being familiar with some of the classical texts written in across disciplines in sociology, humanities, and arts. And therefore we continue with the discussion in terms of talking about how certain text or certain times in certain disciplines we see that a large number of literature has been produced in the Western context, and when we give us a list of readings to the students and they kind of see that most of the readings are coming in from the Western context, they try to have a kind of an understanding that there is a certain kind of Western hegemony, which is a kind of an idea that all knowledge are being produced from the Western society, and therefore not much is been done in the other parts of the world. So can you just elaborate or reflect?
This is an unfortunate part of our history, and this is of course a false idea. Because knowledge has emerged in different kind of contexts at different periods of time. The greatness of the knowledge which was produced in our country were precisely because it was an open society and you had different kinds of ideas which came in and people debated and discussed. Even if you say, if you take Amartya Sen's argumentative Indian, the argument that he is trying to make is that many of our ancient texts were in a debating form when two people were having a discussion. So the entire idea of debate and argumentation was extremely rich in our context. But during the period of colonial rule and Western dominance, the point that became very, very dominant was that all knowledges come from the West, and there was a binary assumed that the West is civilized, the West is more advanced, and we are barbaric. I mean, that was a kind of colonial construction. We have no knowledge, we are primitive, etc. Fortunately, this has been critiqued extensively, and in this series, in fact, we are going to have writings from Gandhi, we'll have writings from Dr. Ambedkar, we'll have writings from Tagore, we'll have writings from Rokia, we'll be having writings from Tarabai Shinde, not just men but women who lived during that period and critiqued these courses. Now this kind of knowledge is not just because they were political actors, but because many of them were great thinkers. So when you take Hind Swaraj of Gandhi, it's a critique of modernity, it's a critique of capitalism, it's a critique of development. And many of the contemporary critiques of development are actually very informed and influenced by Hind Swaraj. So we look back at those kind of texts. So the idea of the West being the sole arbiters of knowledge is obviously fallacious, but this is I would argue a very old idea, because for the last many years there's been a counter narrative. Our syllabi reflects that counter narrative, but, and I think this is important, while we critique Western dominance, the critique is not because they are Western. The critique is about context based. That is the whole argument when Gandhi said the window should be open, ideas should come. The best writings, if you look at writings of Aurobindo, writings of Vivekanand, writings of Veerasalingam in the south, writings of Periyar, these were people who were obviously rooted here, familiar with the olden texts, familiar with their conditions, but were engaging with the West. Say the idea of reason, the idea of equality, the idea of social justice, which was so central in Periyar, was at once borrowed from modern contemporary Western ideas as well as rational ideas from our own tradition. Okay. So if you look at this, dichotomy itself is fallacious. The dichotomy itself is fallacious because, for example, people would say, critique a person because of their origin, that so and so is Western, that is a complicated question. If you look at who speaks for whom becomes difficult. Many people from the West, including Britishers, were part of our independence movement. You know, if you take Sister Nivedita, where did she come from? You know, so you have various kinds of people who came here. You had Tagore and Gandhi engaging with Westerners, who would in turn learn from them. This symbiotic relationship is very, very important. The issue is not about your origins, that are you born here or are you born there. The issue is what you are writing about. So supposing Durkheim is writing about complex division of labor, the question is complex division of labor relevant for us? If he is trying to theorize what is a social fact, does it help us to understand phenomena, say dowry, which is India basic? That is the issue. The issue is not the idea, the method, the rigor, the depth of the knowledge and its application. The issue is not where I am born for. So I can be very much born for here, but I may mechanically reproduce the knowledge of the West here, irrespective of who they are. We don't know. And the problem with the guidebooks here is you don't know who is who. So I have seen guidebooks where they may mention a Foucault and they may mention a Tom Smith, who we don't know who the Tom Smith is, you know. But what they do is they take these people out of their context and put them as just names with certain definition. This series is actually an attempt to challenge that kind of arbitrary, way by which knowledge is produced.
Okay. So it is evident through the discussion that a lot of effort has been gone into selecting text to make it a part of the lecture series. So what actually is very interesting is what prompted you to develop a series called Key Text?
I think some of the issues you have already touched about, but maybe I, as somebody like I said, who've been teaching now, it's embarrassing, more than 3 decades, you know, both initially at an undergraduate college, but later at the university. Many people may feel my experience is limited, and indeed it is limited to the extent that I teach in a metropolitan city. I try to make up by going to many different parts of the country, to the most remote colleges, and seeing what the issue is. And one thing I'm sure is people have the competence to learn. They have the competence to learn new language. I know, and I'm sure you know, of people who would not have known a particular language and they pick it up, you know. They have a competence to read. People work so hard. People, you know, the kind of effort people do to prepare for entrance exam, or for cracking UPSC exam, or entrance to IIT, or entrance to all this, maybe even a university like JNU. What they do not have, and it is our failing, are good textbooks which will introduce them indirectly to original texts, you know. And that's why I find the internet very useful, because if you wish to, if you are curious, you can actually go and see it. Some of the issues which prompted me to do this course is certain stereotypical common sense assumptions that people have. As somebody who is located in a university which has had its own reputation and in a metropolitan city, a lot of people will say that, what would you know? What would you know? वो ivory tower institution है, लोग कैसे स्थिति में पढ़ाई करते, you have no idea, you know. But this is something which I find interesting, because anybody who is familiar with a university would know that 90% of people actually come from small towns, villages, many first generation learners, you know. How is it that once they come, they are able to do all this? Because there is a certain effort. It depends on us. If many of us have failed to do it, that how do we manage to teach complex? I don't think they're complex, but we have an assumption, original must be more difficult. So here is the issue which also prompted me. We need to use a fancy word, maybe, debunk that idea of easy and difficult. When people say easy, they mean ki they have to memorize a definition and reproduce it. Difficult is when you have to explain it in your own words, you know, which raises us to the question of language. The whole issue that in which language, particularly in social sciences and humanities, it is unlike algebra or chemistry, it is written in language. So the idea of language becomes very important, and therefore there are many people in our country who are equally equipped in 2 languages or 3 languages, and I think this challenge should be taken up, by which many of these texts could be translated. The text, the other thing which prompted me is that we are actually cheating. We are actually cheating when we say that, look, we have to cater to the mass of people, they will not understand, unko samajh nahi aayenge, so we cannot teach difficult texts.
Okay.
That is elitism of the worst kind, कि सिर्फ elites ही समझ सकते हैं text और बाकी लोग नहीं समझ सकते हैं. This is a false dichotomy, because you cannot have equality without quality. This hierarchy will remain as long as we do not engage. So I thought, and the other reason which prompted me is some of these texts are beautiful. And when we discuss those texts and we show you what the kind of writings they write, you yourself will be prompted. And as I mentioned, they are not Western exclusive, they are also Indian texts. Ideally, we should probably have even a non-Indian, non-Western text to complete the series.
Okay. So I think this is a good platform where we are talking about students who are more keen in learning in non-metropolitan, and we also have certain problems in terms of non-availability of some of the text in some of the remote libraries. We might have a problem of the academics in terms of the kind of teaching that is done. So this is one platform through which students will have a clear idea of what these texts are putting across, and we'll get an idea of how to actually go about reading, building an interest in these texts.
Yeah, this also raises the question of democratization, because this technology, the fact that the government has this opportunity is democratization, so that what one teaches is no longer confined only to face-to-face interaction in the classroom. Anywhere, anybody can ask any question, and you are equally accessible to all. This is so important. It breaks down barriers. It breaks down barriers. I must give you an example, and this is somebody maybe you would recall, Maitrayee, who was visually challenged. He came from a very remote village in Tamil Nadu, and this was a student that I had many decades ago, and he would speak very well in English, and write. And I would ask, how do you speak like this, and he said, I used to listen to the radio.
Yes.
And I used to listen to BBC and VOA, So it became learning, mass media being a tool for learning, and this particular platform helps us to do it. So maybe if we can have a combination of extracts from the original texts and then explanation of those original texts, and secondly, locating those texts. ऐसा नहीं लगना चाहिए कि who are these characters, that who, when I first heard a lecture on Durkheim, I didn't understand who is this Durkheim, where was he born, which country was he born, why am I learning him. These are as important as the 5 points that you have to learn and answer. In fact, when young people learn the context, they learn the content more easily. If you have no idea about the content, then the content becomes a mechanical exercise. Supposing we say it was the age of reason in enlightenment, and we are only trying to focus कि कैसे रट ले कि enlightenment reason. Then we are not going to follow that why it happened, what were the questions they were raising, what was the structure in Europe at that time. It was deeply feudal, the church was omnipresent, there was a movement to question this. Then people will say, okay, reason means that we don't take anything for granted. Earlier, if you fell ill, they would say that God had it was a divine decision, it was the wish of God. You didn't ask, you said, why is a person poor? You said a person is poor because it was divinely ordained. Reason meant, no, we must ask, is poverty humanly constructed? Is wealth humanly constructed? Now, if I have to ask questions about poverty and wealth, I can't compartmentalize and say, no, I will teach from sociology and I will teach from political science, you know. These thinkers, whether it is Keynes or Adam Smith or Marx, Weber or Durkheim, or our own thinkers from this part of the world, are people who are engaging with the social, and that social remains relevant to us even today.
So when we talk about technology, and we are talking about technology in terms of internet and mobile, we also have one challenge that we as teachers face, that is to draw the attention of students, because nowadays with these mobiles and androids and everything, they is at a easy ready-made kind of a thing. So do you think that when these shortcuts are available in terms of reading it on the mobile, students will actually go back and pick up a text and do a kind of a reading?
You know, the technology is neutral. Its use is not. You can use the smartphone for pornography, you can use the smartphone for reading philosophy. In itself, it is neutral. It is for us to make a certain kind of knowledge more attractive. Now, the whole question is not just a question of whether they will make an effort to, but also the whole question which you raised earlier about flagging attention. You know, because everything is so exciting now. If you look at old news, say in the 70s or 80s, we didn't even have television in the 70s, but maybe in the early years of television, people would read news. All India Radio, you had wonderful voices and they would read news. Very informed news, slow and, you know, nothing exciting. Now our news are set in a way which is like entertainment. In fact, it is accepted. It's infotainment, information plus news. So the format has made it very difficult for us to retain attention. If I give a lecture, you know, just speaking like that, it is not attractive enough. You need props, you need PowerPoint, and if with PowerPoint, maybe if you have photographs, if you have visuals, it becomes more attractive. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We can even have text with all the props, you know. The issue is not that. The issue is that serious texts do needs a little bit of time to engage. And today people get restless because a span of attention has become very limited. Since I also work on the media, one of the issues which advertisers are debating is that people's attention span has reduced, say, from 5 seconds to 1 second. So they have to now produce an ad which in 1 second is able to communicate. Now, it is not easy for academics to compete with that kind of you know, advertisements which are glossy, which are smart, which also attract people. Why do they attract people? Even the little baby will be singing along with the advertisements, you know, because there is a manner in which you are touching the core, of the audience. That touching the core either through music or through visuals or sometimes through certain kind of images and ideas which are accepted in society, you know. Whereas in academic, social science, literature, humanities, often what we say is contra to what people believe. So people will say that we are poor because we have too much people, and if we had less people we would be richer. Okay, now there are whole theories which have debated this issue, that the moment you become more prosperous, your population declines. You know, so in the West, in fact, the issue is that there is not enough babies being born. You know, so you have issues. Now, normally in our everyday life, when we talk about babies being born, we don't think it's a theoretical question or thinkers are involved. Okay, but the issue is also, therefore, to connect your everyday experiential personal lives with broader thought and thinkers. Don't think of them, that is difficult, that is padhai, that is knowledge, and this is just living. You know, there is a way, and these texts are so wonderful. We'll show you as we move along. They will be able to connect what C. Wright Mills would say the biography with history. The personal with public. You know, for example, you would know Mills talks about unemployment. A person is unemployed, they are so sad, they are upset, ghar pe baap hai, mother hai, what do you do? And then you realize when you enter social science, others are too are unemployed, and that it's a public issue. That we have to now look at economic policies, state policies, market policies, which kind of policies lead to greater employment, which kind of policies lead to greater underemployment or overemployment, you know. And then you start seeing the relationship between the personal and the theoretical. The personal and the public, you know. So this, I think, is what is one of the attempts that will be made to. It is a challenge, but I think it is worth exploring.
So it's quite interesting, and it's in a way drawing my attention to just start listening to the way in which these texts are. But one last question, like the way we read a text and we need to connect to the current problem, is it also necessary that when we are reading a text, for instance, if we are reading C. Wright Mills' Sociological Imagination, is it also important for a student or for a reader to go back and know the context or the biography of the writer, so that the connection becomes a little more
absolutely broadened. Because these thinkers, just like you and me, are also products of the societies that they lived in. C. Wright Mills, for example, wrote his Sociological Imagination in 1959. Post-World to America, very, very prosperous, great advances in social sciences, in sociology in particular, but an inability to make that connection. Lot of data was being collected, but there was a certain disengagement with the data. Was meant to, you are either supplying that data for market research or advertisers, and they were using it for their maybe pushing a particular product or particular policy, but you were not engaging with the relationship between the individual and the society, which is actually the crux of all humanities, all social sciences, the basic question of constraint and freedom. You began with your choice credit system, that choice. What is the opposite of choice? Constraint. And you look at all philosophers from any time, Indian, Western, any philosopher, and you will say this is a fundamental question that is being asked: are we free or are we bounded? When Weber talks about the iron cage, when he talks about bureaucracy and how bureaucracy can over rationalize, and you have estranged human being, and you say ki kahan pe Weber, where are we talking about bureaucracy? But if you see a very old television program called Office, and the way they make people run around, all of you are young, you would know you have to fill up a form, you have to fill up a certain money, maybe now it is online, maybe the net is not working, maybe the queues, etc. And you feel ki, you know, you are being absolutely burdened, jo pis gaye, you know. Now, why is that experience that you are having your own personal, individual, or is this a product of a certain bureaucratic structure? Let's do Weber's bureaucracy, and you will understand, was he relevant, was he, or does the bureaucracy still operate in that fashion? Unfortunately, fortunately, it does, you know. So the question of relevance will keep going back. Their context within which the thinkers wrote, and the context within which we are, you know, living in.
So I think we have had Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri has discussed in detail the rationale of developing a series on key text, and she has also told us that it will cover a number of texts across discipline, and will be not only discussing text from Western literature, but also from our own country and from across other parts of the world, and also that we will keep in mind that reading text is not only doing a kind of visual reading of a book, but we will try to make it more interactive by using visuals, by using text lines from the text, and therefore we try our best to make it more interesting and more interactive, so that we at least try to reach out a certain number of people who can begin reading and taking interest in the text that has been written by large number of scholars. With this, I think we come to an end to this.
Maybe just one last point that I can sort of guess in. You know, when we discuss social sciences and humanities, and I made the point that basically everybody was talking about studying the social and the relationship between the individual and society, constraint and coercion. What do we mean by the social? It basically means social institutions and social ideas. Social institutions like education, politics, economics, religion, kinship, marriage, family. Then we have the whole idea of culture as a whole, which is integrated, questions of rationality, questions of technology. Take any of these institutions and processes and ask the question that did these thinkers address them or not? Because these thinkers are products of modernity. We are not looking at pre-modern thinkers. We are looking at thinkers who have emerged from modernity and were engaging with institutions of modernity. So that relevance remains. Likewise, ideas of democracy, ideas of social justice, ideas of individualism, ideas of alienation, anomie are as central today in 21st century as suicides rise, children die before exams, than ever before, to return to those texts.
I think it's very interesting to carry on with the discussions, but today's time is limited. We'll come back with this key series discussion on key text very soon, and you can put across your queries and questions, because we'll have Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri doing some of these key text in the coming months very soon. Thank you very much.